It's been 28 years since the world witnessed one of the grimmest events in 1994, the Rwandan Genocide, which claimed over 800,000 lives. In just 100 days, Hutu extremists have slaughtered the minority Tutsis community. Rwandan President Paul Kagame has accused France of backing those who carried out the massacres, a charge denied by Paris. Kayel Kumalo has been following the story for us.
The month of April will always be a constant reminder of the gory scenes in Rwanda. Members of the Hutu ethnic majority murdered as many as 800,000 people, mostly of the Tutsi minority. This after their aircraft carrying the former president of Rwanda, Juvenal Habyarimana, was shot down in Kigali, leaving no survivors. After that incident, the genocide started. Masterminded by Hutu nationalists, Rwandan President Paul Kagame says they've come a very long way.
Rwandans, I think all Rwandans have participated in that. But Rwandans have been participating in that under the leadership that was put in place since the genocide was over. When we took power in 1994, we brought together Rwandans from different political backgrounds and came together, implemented what remained of a peace process we had reached in Arusha in 1993.
Local officials and the Hutu-led government encouraged people to take up arms and kill their neighbors. When the Rwandese Patriotic Front gained control, it was too late. Thousands had been massacred and over 2 million refugees fled Rwanda and created a humanitarian crisis. Kagame says this should never happen again.
Divides don't just disappear. You have to ensure that you put in place policies and political programs and other programs that people will build on to ensure that they can realize they have more in common than what should, that brings them together than what should divide them.
28 years later down the line, Rwanda has positioned itself as one of the thriving economies in Africa. Recently, a Rwandan appeals court upheld a 25-year jail term for Paul Rusesabagina, who was portrayed in the movie Hotel Rwanda, sheltering thousands of people during the 1994 genocide. He has since acknowledged having a leadership role in the Rwanda movement for democratic change, but denied responsibility for attacks. Kayel Kumalo, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Now, tomorrow, the 7th of April, will mark the International Day of Reflection on the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. To reflect on this gruesome event 28 years on, we're now joined by Dr. Mustafa Yusuf Ali, who's a scholar of international relations, specializing in security issues in the Horn of Africa region. Dr. Ali, thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program. It's been 28 years.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
It's been 28 years, but it was such a gruesome and horrific time that it is something that we find ourselves having to continue to talk about and reflect on. And I just wonder, 28 years on, what should we be thinking and reflecting?
Thank you. One of the main things that we should be thinking about and reflecting on is that such a genocide on such a large scale, crimes against humanity should not have happened in the first place and should have been prevented, particularly by the international community that was there in Rwanda. But now that that did not happen and the Tutsi minority were killed in that genocide, what automatically comes to mind is that such a thing should never happen again. And therefore, all measures should be put in place to ensure that such happening, such genocide, such horrendous criminal acts against the human race never happens again. And it is important that particularly the younger generation kept reminded that such heinous crimes against the people of Rwanda took place, and that they should know that they have a stake to be educated on and to educate others, that such horrendous acts of genocide should not happen again, not just in Rwanda, but anywhere in the world.
It may have not happened since at that scale, but one does hear, sadly, and we've just done a story now in Tigray where we're hearing that some of the attacks could be described as genocide because a particular group of people were targeted because of their ethnicity. So does that tell us that we haven't learned anything from the Rwandan genocide over time?
I think if you look at how the Rwandese have taken the act of prevention and to ensure that this never happens again, it is exemplary. It's just that now other countries have not learned about this kind of act that can happen on any population for political reasons. And yes, I think we can say that in some of the countries in Africa, we really haven't learned the lessons that the Rwandese have learned, and that others have learned in the past before the Rwanda genocide, the Holocaust in Germany, and many other places, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We need to put in place mechanisms that actually prevents this kind of actions. And in the case of Ethiopia, I think there is a lot for Ethiopians to learn from countries such as Rwanda, Bosnia, Herzegovina, what happened in Germany, in order to protect civilians or members of a particular ethnic community.
One of the criticisms at the time is that the United Nations didn't want to call a thing because had it been named properly, they would have been forced to act and act much quicker. Do you think that there's still a resistance sometimes to call a thing a thing? A genocide is a genocide, and sometimes politics comes into play and people don't want to call it that. They'll use words like conflict and other words, except for what it really is.
An awful lot of times, unfortunately, there are double standards practiced by the international community. And we see this happening even today, what is happening in Ukraine. If what is happening in Ukraine was happening in Africa, there won't be that much mobilization by the so-called international community. And there was a failure by the international community, by the United Nations, to call what it was, genocide, or what was going on in Rwanda at that time. And it took the leadership of Rwandese in the name of Paul Kagame to actually mobilize and stop that genocide that was happening on the minority Tutsi population. And so because the UN and the international community took time to actually call genocide, many more people lost their lives. And this is one of the major bone of contention by the Rwandese authorities and others in Africa of why the UN was so slow in acting. And there are many people in the UN, including the then commander of the UN forces in in Rwanda, who said that there was a mistake on the part of the United Nations, not calling genocide a genocide, and to then come up and deploy what needed to be deployed in order to stop that genocide at that time. By the time UN and the international community was calling what happened in Rwanda genocide, it was very late, and close to 1 million people had lost their lives.
Do you think that regional bodies like the African Union, ECOWAS, East African Community, SADC, COMESA, you name it, that they have the mechanisms in place to have early warning signals that we could be seeing something developing here? Because prevention and acting quickly certainly is the way to go. And if we had those in place, perhaps we might not see some of the things that have happened since Rwanda.
Fortunately, most of the sub-regional organizations or regional organizations like IGAD, ECOWAS, SADC, East African Community have a very good intelligence and can tell the early warning signs, and in order to prevent conflicts or killings or genocide from happening. A lot of times, countries or regional bodies don't just act on what is happening on the ground because they claim not to interfere with the internal affairs of a specific country. So that happens, and then you end up with what happened in Rwanda. There is the notion of the responsibility to protect, which really came out of Africa and came out of the learnings from what happened in Rwanda, that nations, the international community, have the responsibility to protect civilians who are at risk of being killed en masse. This is what the African Union, the United Nations should always deploy in order to protect civilians. Unfortunately, responsibility to protect was misused by the NATO countries when the UN declared that a genocide was impending in Libya, and some of the Western countries, instead of only preventing the genocide from happening, went as far as executing regime change in Libya that led to the killing of Muammar Gaddafi. And that has made it a little more difficult for many countries to actually focus on the responsibility to protect. And this calls for a lot of education of nationals and focusing on governance, good governance and stability, stabilizing African countries. Yes, UN and regional organizations have a huge responsibility to actually ensure that genocide do not happen, and they should be ready to actually interfere with the internal affairs of any country that are targeting their citizens and killing them.
Do we understand the process of getting to a point of genocide? And maybe it's, I don't know, ordering society beforehand to make sure that we don't get there, so that we don't have another Gukurahundi that we saw in Zimbabwe, effacer le tableau that we saw in the Democratic Republic of Congo with the pygmies being killed, and also in Darfur.
Here, the thing here is education, and I'm very happy to see how the Rwandese have handled this whole a notion of education, so that it does not happen, such an act does not happen again. Institutions such as Aegis Trust in Rwanda and many others around Africa have focused on addressing hate crimes. And it all starts with hating the other or othering the other. And so these kind of institutions have put in a lot of efforts to actually try to prevent hate, starting with hate speech, and educating the younger generation about why we all need to be inclusive in the way we work, being empathetic to the other. And that is what is going to stop this kind of acts. Education, 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 and remembering, commemorating such days in order to remind those that have the ideas of hate that their ideas could lead to murder on a large scale, and therefore to actually educate people and remind them and to commemorate such days so that there is no denial of genocide. Today, there are still people who deny that there was genocide in Rwanda. There are people who still deny that there was genocide in Germany. There are people who deny that there was genocide on the Hereros in Namibia, the first genocide of the 19th century. And so through education, we can actually stop this kind of denial, and the deniers then would be ashamed of their actions.
Dr. Ali, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed for that valuable input as the world starts tomorrow, International Day of Reflection on the 1994 Rwanda Genocide. Thank you for your time.